All right, welcome back to another episode of the Home Turf Podcast. This is episode 18. I put a question mark on the Google Doc because it's kind of episode 20. I'm going to get into that real quick. Episode 18 from last week against Mississippi State. We were not able to get that podcast uploaded in time because we had some issues with storage and whatnot. So there is no Mississippi State podcast. I'm a little bit salty about it because I thought it was a really good episode, but we are back again for the Alabama podcast. I am here today with two guests. I am here accompanied by my editor-in-chief, Michaela Rush. You want to say hi?
Howdy, y'all. Thank you for having me. I will confess I am not a sports aficionado, but I do love talking to people and I do love the podcast. So thank you so much for having me on, Jordan.
And then this week we have on from the Crimson White, Ashley Woods. Ashley, do you want to say something to the people real quick?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on. I'm so super excited to talk some football today. I know a little bit more than Michaela, so I can help filter the conversation just a little bit. That's what I'm here for. But I'm super excited to be on.
Now, before we go ahead and get started on this, I do have to do an ad read because this podcast is sponsored by Hitch. For all your ride-sharing needs, make sure you check out Hitch. If you're needing to travel across the state, it's like Uber, but it's for longer distances. For 30% off your first 4 rides, up to $50 each ride, use code AggieNews3. That's spelled AGGIENEWS3. Thanks again to Hitch for sponsoring this episode. And now let's go ahead and get into it with Alabama week. Last week, Alabama went to Fayetteville to play against Arkansas, and they beat them by, I believe, 23 was the final score. And as far as A&M goes, they just came off a loss in Starkville, Mississippi against Mississippi State, an unranked Mississippi State team, their second unranked loss of the year, Mississippi State now being ranked. I can't get a read on A&M right now, but how do you feel about Alabama football so far in the season, about 1/3-ish of the way through the season?
Yeah, I think Alabama's in a good position. They are kind of what we expected going into the season, especially on the defensive side of the ball, flying around the field. Will Anderson, Dallas Turner, being mainly the mainstays, but also Brian Branch, who has had a spectacular season so far in the secondary. So the defensive side of the ball has lived up to its to the hype. The offensive side of the ball has had its struggles with drops, receivers not necessarily getting open. But I think those problems are minuscule in the grand scheme of things. I think they've executed on a high level. We're still Alabama is still winning games by like 20 plus points. So the drops you don't want to see the drops. You don't want to see the missed coverages, the not getting open for receivers. But I think as far as what we expected for the season, Alabama's living up to the standards. I think going into the season, it was Georgia, Alabama were the two teams, and then everybody else was fighting for 3 through 25. So I think that's how it's kind of lived up so far.
Yeah, for sure. I know Georgia has seemed to slip a little bit over the last couple of weeks. I think that's maybe a nice way to say it. A little bit of a scare against Kent State and then a big scare against Missouri last week. Alabama is looking like the big dog again. It's either them or Ohio State probably at the top of the nation in college football right now. But let's go ahead and get started on that offensive side of the ball that you had mentioned. I think that this is kind of an interesting year for Alabama's offense because Bryce Young coming off a Heisman campaign last season, but the offense, even though they're 4th in the nation in total yards per game, 525 yards per game, is this wrong for me to say that it maybe feels slightly less powerful than years past? Is that absurd for me to say, even as good as they are?
No, I don't think it's necessarily absurd. It's what we're seeing on the field. When you have receivers that come through with the names of Julio Jones, Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, Jaylen Waddle, Devonte Smith, when you have those names come through, that speed on the field, Jamison Williams, John Mechie, all that speed on the field, you can't really replace that. And not to say that we don't have speed. We have Tyler Harrell. We have JoJo Earl. They haven't played too much because they've been dealing with some injuries, but there definitely is speed. I just think for the past few years, we've been seeing from this Alabama offense this like record breaking on like irreplaceable type of speed. That speed's now been translated to the NFL. And it's hard to replace that because these are one of a kind players. They set records, and they broke the records that they set here at Alabama. So I think this year feels a little bit different because we don't have that speed on the field that we haven't had it consistently. I do say we have it in our depth chart. It just hasn't been on the field too much. We still have players like Ja'Cory Brooks, like I mentioned earlier, Tyler and JoJo. Those are really speedy receivers. And I think Trayshawn Holden has some deceptive speed as well. So I think it's not too absurd because it's what we're seeing on the field. It's harder for receivers to get separation because they don't have that natural speed off the ball. Like the other receivers that I've named ahead of time beforehand, but as I think it's allowed us to become a little bit more balanced than we've been in the past, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We have somebody like Jahmyr Gibbs who is a scat back. He can run downhill, but you put him out in the screen, you put him out in open space, he's just gonna run. And like we saw it, we two drives, 270 plus yard plays. I mean, there's their speed right there. So I think we've become more balanced than we've had in the year past, and it's making people be like, oh, is Alabama okay? Yeah, we're still okay. Alabama's okay. It's just, Devonte Smith is not on the field as a wide receiver. He is on the field as a cornerback. That is not a joke. That is actually true. We have somebody on the team on the defensive side of the ball named Devonte Smith. Spelled the exact same way, and he plays corner. And it was very confusing when I was writing. I had to make sure that I was like, I'm like, yeah, he graduated. It's a new Devonte. So spelled the exact same way. It's absolutely hilarious.
Nice. So yeah, new Devonte. That's funny. That's gonna be tricky to keep up with. But I kind of want to circle back to a little bit what you were saying about Jahmyr Gibbs. I mean, like talk about a great week. Last week we got the 206 rushing yards. He just got named the national running back of the week. Like that's a big deal. So what are you kind of looking for in him this week, especially playing against A&M? Like, is there certain expectations you're having in terms of stats or just what we should be looking out for, especially as non folks who don't get to see him play quite as regularly?
I think my expectations kind of change depending who's under center. Of course, with Bryce injuring his shoulder halfway, partially through the second quarter, the playbook definitely changes when you have Jaylen Monroe in versus when you have Bryce Young. And I think if you have Bryce in, you're going to see more of Jahmyr's pass catching side and how lethal he is in the pass game. You saw a little bit of that with Jaylen Monroe. I want to preface this. Jaylen Monroe is a talented passer. He was being recruited by Texas A&M before he came to Alabama. So and Jimbo Fisher talked about his arm strength and his accuracy. So he's a very talented passer. His game reminds me a lot of Jalen Hurts. That's funny. But they're very similar in that way. But I will preface is that like Jaylen Monroe is a talented passer. However, he's very athletic and he runs a little bit more than Bryce does. Bryce is a person who is mobile. He can run if he wants to, but his dad has talked about it. He has talked about it. He wants to get the ball into their hands of his playmakers, that his receivers, his backs and stuff. So he's going to find ways to get the ball into Jahmyr's hands, Jermaine Burton's hands, Cameron Latu's hands. He's going to do that. Jaylen is going to try to have him. It's going to be with Jaylen under the center. I think it's going to be more run heavy for Jahmyr. I think you saw that against Arkansas when Jaylen came in. It became a little bit more run heavy on the offense. I don't know if that's because they were trying to work Jaylen in. It was a awkward situation where he came in with Bryce getting injured. You don't really expect that, so you don't want to throw him into the fire. But I do think with Jaylen, it's going to be a little bit more run heavy, so you're going to see just how lethal Jahmyr is in the run game. He's a Swiss Army knife, so he can do it all. So I think the game plan depends on who's under center because what each quarterback brings to the table kind of directly affects how games are going to get called and how his numbers are going to get called and used, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then especially talking a little bit, circling again, you're giving me some great transitions here. Talking more about Bryce Young, obviously not expected. You don't ever expect anyone to go and hurt. But based on what I was reading before this, it doesn't seem like he's going to be playing this weekend, but there's not really a definitive answer. Do you have any insight on that, on if he's expecting to be playing time this week, or is he going to be out for the next couple weeks, or just anything you can share on that?
You know about as much as I do.
Okay.
Because Nick Saban, he's very like Kurt Bonk on injuries. Like, he's going to tell you what the injury is. He's going to say it's day to day, week to week, and you're just going to have to take for it. He's not going to give you like a definitive timetable, which it sucks for our job. But at the end of the day, he gonna give us what give us, and we got to work with it. So he is listed as day to day with a shoulder sprain. I think it's the sprain in his AC joint up here, but which is, thank God, because it looked like it could have been worse the way he reacted on the field. So thank God it wasn't as bad that it could have been. But it's a sprain. He, like I said earlier, he likes to throw. He's a quarterback. He wants to throw 20, 30 times in a game sometimes. So you want to make sure he's okay, because I talked to this with a couple of people, I would rather have Bryce later down in the stretch than like we risk him now. And then he said, not to say that I'm not confident in Jaylen, but you want your best players at the times of when you really want them to succeed. So I think, yeah, he could. It really just depends. We have a really good sports science program here. We have a really good athletic training program here. So it just really depends on what they say. And if he says he's good to go play on Saturday, he's good to go to play on Saturday. But if he's not, he's not. They take injuries pretty seriously here. So they take it step by step. And it's really indicative of what they see throughout the week. So we'll probably learn a little bit more tomorrow if Nick Saban is willing to give tomorrow during his evening press conference. But I don't expect much more out of day-to-day other than day-to-day. So
yeah, for sure. And it was definitely funny because, again, with my limited football knowledge, if I'm looking and I'm seeing a game that involves Bama, and then I'm seeing somebody go back to a tent with a shoulder injury, my brain immediately goes to the lore of last year and Calzada going out during the fourth quarter and just coming right back in. But I think honestly, this was a good reminder for me that it could have been a lot worse, and it seems like he's in good shape now. But yeah, I'm interested to see when he'll come back and if that'll be sooner rather than later. But yeah, like you said, we'll just have to wait and see. And I get it. You don't want to say they're coming back in earlier than they are, but yeah.
I definitely think it's probably not too dissimilar to Jimbo Fisher during the press conference this last week said, "What do you expect me to do? Call Nick Saban and tell him who we're going to play at quarterback," when someone asked him about Max Johnson's injury, which he's also dealing with. So A&M kind of has a question mark on whether it'll be Max Johnson, Haynes King. Some people are throwing Connor Wigman's name in there. I doubt he plays, at least not yet. But I definitely think that it's sort of one of these things where maybe both teams don't really know who's going to be playing by the time that the game comes, or at least the people outside of it. I'm sure that the people inside know exactly what's happening. But I thought it was interesting you talking about, the difference between the game plan for both quarterbacks. I mean, for Milroe, as you mentioned, he's kind of a much more willing athlete than, say, Bryce Young, because I like to say that Bryce Young is a reluctant runner. Not that he's a bad runner. He just doesn't run when he doesn't need to. I think about sort of like, not saying that he plays like Russell Wilson, but that's the type of mindset Russell Wilson has as an athlete. He is willing to run when he needs to, but he would much rather run to throw than run to run. And so I kind of wanted to mention a couple things that I noticed when I was kind of digging through the numbers. You mentioned Jahmyr Gibbs' ability as a receiver. Alabama, I said, it feels like they have slightly less firepower than years past, not saying that they're not as good, because they're still fourth in the nation in total yards per game, but kind of to show how they've been spreading the love across receivers. 7 players with 100 plus receiving, 3 with 200 plus. 2 of them are Trayshawn Holden and Kobe Prentice, who me and my co-editor argued on who would be the leading receiver at Alabama. He took Kobe Prentice's side. I took Trayshawn Holden's side. We'll see who ends up winning that one. But Jahmyr Gibbs too. You mentioned Jahmyr Gibbs as a receiver, 200 plus receiving yards. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how they utilize that part of the game heading into A&M week. Mostly because I think A&M is much more susceptible to the running game than the passing game. They look like one of the best passing defenses in the country, although you wouldn't really say that after that Mississippi State game, but that's also just Mississippi State. That's what they do.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to see what kind of game plan Alabama takes this week. And to flip that to the other side, defensive, you mentioned the defense of Alabama is the bread and butter of this program. 11 points per game, fifth in the nation. They're fifth in the nation in yards per game, 236. Talk about what exactly the defense has been doing so far this season, because it's just chock full of talent right now.
Yeah, I just think we have a lot of talent, and that talent is executing. There have been teams where, you have a lot of talent, A&M. You have a lot of talent, and you don't really execute on the field. So I think the talent is executing. You have players, you have veterans all throughout this defensive side of the ball. You have players like DJ Dale. Up front, you have Will Anderson and Dallas Turner, who has really come on his own, especially with Drew Sanders heading over to Arkansas, who played really well against us at Arkansas. Coming into his own, and then Henry Tohoto, who I think has been kind of underrated this season, but he has been really spectacular on that side of the ball in the linebacker core. And then, like I said earlier, Brian Branch and Jordan Battle in the secondary. I think our secondary has been, that was probably the weak spot everybody pointed at the beginning of the season, where could Alabama be vulnerable, and that would be our passing game, because our secondary is relatively young and inexperienced. But I think when the bell has been rung, they've answered the call, and I think they've done a good job at holding some really, really talented receivers, not only in the SEC but in college ball, to just minimal yardage. I mean, you don't get to, in this day and age in college football, you don't hold offenses to only 200 yards per game without some of that being on the secondary side of the ball. So I think the defense has just lived up to the expectations, and they executed when they need to. Of course, there are times where there's missed tackles and stuff like that, nitpicky stuff. But I think all in all, there's not too much you can ask, too much more you can ask of this defense.
I think definitely the front seven is the strong suit of Alabama this year. They've had so much talent come through the program, and yet they're still constantly pumping it out. I'm glad you mentioned Henry Tohoto. He's one person that I wrote down in my notes, because I think he is one of the better players on Alabama that people don't really talk about. Just like simple stats, leads and tackles, 33. Will Anderson Jr., absolute monster, leads a team in sacks with 5. That's more than double of anybody else on the team. And you mentioned some of the other players, but kind of talk about what exactly Alabama does on defense that makes them so good. Is it just the execution that they have? Is it the talent, or is it the mixture of both, or is it this like insane defensive plan that they have that kind of just gives teams a run for their money?
I think to answer your question, I think you gotta look at the defensive coordinator, and I think Pete Golden has done a really good job, and his staff has done a really good job of getting the team to fly to the ball. They're quick off the ball. There were a couple of plays against Arkansas and throughout the season where Will Anderson was in the backfield, like just as the ball snapped. Like, they're quick off the ball, they can fly across the field. One of the things I love about Henry Tohoto is he can go sideline to sideline. He can go across the field like it's nothing. He doesn't look out of breath or anything. They are ball hawks. That a lot of that defense is the ball hawks. They want to go after the ball. They're going to make tackles. They've made a lot of good open field tackles when they needed to. I think the biggest thing I would talk about is just, their ability to fly around the field. I think their effort is just a step up than what it was last year. You can see them trying to get to the ball, trying to force turnovers and trying to force sacks and pressures maybe they don't get to the quarterback, but they pressure the quarterback into making an error or making a throw or anything like that. The secondary is really trying to play defense to the defend the ball and stuff like that. I think they are just really paying attention to what the ball does, what the ball handler does, and just adjusting to that. I think their speed, like we're talking about the lack of speed on the offensive side of the ball. I think the defensive side of the ball has a lot of speed, especially with Dallas Turner and Will Anderson.
And one interesting stat that I pulled up when I was looking at Alabama's numbers, this is something that doesn't stand out to me as a very Alabama number, but only 2 turnovers so far this season. I don't think that's going to make a big difference in the A&M game, but kind of just for Alabama going forward, that's something that you usually see is ball production on defense in that facet. I think that could make a difference, though, especially if we end up seeing Haynes King start, because this number could be wrong, but I believe he has 5 interceptions thrown in his career starts across. Let me scratch that. Not career starts, as in 5 interceptions thrown across his last 5 games, including the Colorado game where he was injured in the first game. So he is very turnover prone. I think that could definitely be a time when Alabama could start to see that production. But do you think that the turnovers is something that is just maybe not shaking Alabama's way going forward, or do you think that's not something that people need to worry about?
You mentioned it just before that question. It just depends on who the quarterback is. I think we've faced quarterbacks that are really good at protecting the ball. We face offenses that are really good at protecting the ball. And if the turnover ain't there, the turnover is not there. Because if you try to force a turnover, you maybe have a missed tackle, busted coverage, you may get called for PI. So sometimes the turnover is not there. Now, if you know that you're going against a quarterback or somebody that has had a lot of fumbles, that's in your mind to know that, like, you can probably force them to make those mistakes. But I don't think the defense is really necessarily going after that. They're trying to just be as well-rounded of a defense that they can be. Of course, there are going to be stats that are higher than others because you're trying to be as well-rounded as possible. But the turnovers are going to come, and they're probably going to come at the times that we least expected, but they're the most important times. So
now let's kind of get into expectations for the game. I will be making my way down there. So tell me what I can expect from the game when I'm there. What can A&M fans expect for Alabama to try to do? As we mentioned, it's a little bit hard to answer that question because we don't entirely know exactly who's going to be playing quarterback, but just kind of the general expectation for the game.
For anybody that is out there expecting deja vu of what happened last year, yes, I know Texas A&M lost to Mississippi State the week before they played Alabama. Yes, I know they looked terrible against Mississippi State last year. Yes, I know Alabama looked good against their opponent. The opponent slipped in my head. I think, was it Ole Miss something? It's slipping my mind at the moment. I know they looked great against their opponent, and then they turn around and look terrible against Ole Miss. This is not a case of deja vu. This is a completely different A&M team here, and I just don't foresee the same thing happening where they can just step up to an opponent. I just haven't seen that from that team, to that ability. Last year, even though they started off good and they had a little rough spot, you kind of thought that they could get up for a game like this. I don't see it with this team. I think this team has had a lot of struggles that they've had to overcome, and then some of them have just been too great to overcome, like that run defense. Ooh, Chad, that run defense is not great. And it's just not great. Last year, that run defense was very stout. It's just, you lost a lot of talent, and although you replaced the talent, you have a top recruiting class. The talent has not executed at the level that they're supposed to. And I think this is just a very different Alabama team than it was last year. You can talk about all the crap that happened between Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher before the season. You can talk about that and how that factors in. But I just think at the end of the day, whether that happened or not, these are two very different teams than what we saw in 2021. So I'm not really expecting anything deja vu. Like, I just think Alabama is ready to come out and execute. That loss does affect them. They are thinking about that loss that they had last year. Luckily, the game is in Tuscaloosa, where they tend to play a little bit better with the home field advantage. But I don't see deja vu here. The deja vu, no. I don't expect a blowout because this is SEC play. You can't predict a blowout in SEC play. It's going to be tough. I mean, yeah, the Arkansas score wound up being the Arkansas score, but Arkansas was 26-23. They were only down by a few points at one point. I think 28-23. I may be mistaken on that, but they were only down by a possession. And then we kind of just blew it out of the water. So this game could get competitive, but I just don't see Texas A&M bringing the same bite that they did last year.
Yeah, and I think that that's a fair way to put it. I mean, it is definitely a different team on I think both A&M and Bama are very different teams this year. And also it cannot be denied the effect that the 12th man has in Kyle Field. So that's definitely another factor. The last time that A&M beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa was when Johnny Manziel played here, when we were all in middle school. So it's doable, but I don't think this team is going to be the one to do it. Now, as you mentioned, I am hoping for a competitive game. I think if we can hold on to the ball and stop messing around with the stupid turnovers, we might have a good shot at just, not embarrassing ourselves. But I'm just excited to see what happens, especially as we get those quarterback spots filled, because thinking about the different combinations, how that could happen, again, even with my limited sports knowledge, the way each potential variation could go looks greatly different, especially given just what I know about the difference even between Hanks King and Max Johnson's performances. So
now, what I always like to say too on these episodes is I have my guests come on and I ask them for a prediction. You don't need to give me a score. So don't worry about that. But just how do you predict the game panning out? You mentioned that you think it's going to be a close one that could result in a potential Alabama scoring fest at the end that maybe makes it look like it wasn't as close as it was, or how do you think this game's going to pan out in the end?
It's an SEC game, so you can't rule out the fact that this could wind up being close. The week prior to Auburn, everybody was like, yeah, spooky things happen during odd years when Alabama plays them, but this year ain't gonna be the year. And that game wound up going to 4 overtimes. So it's SEC competition. You simply cannot rule out the possibility of it wind up getting close, and there's a little hair that sticks up on the back of your neck. I do, however, predict an Alabama win. I don't know how big that win is going to be, but I just think Alabama is the better team through and through. Even if you go down the depth chart with Jaylen Monroe coming in as starting quarterback, I just think this team could be a little bit too much to handle for Texas A&M to handle. I mean, Mississippi State was too much to handle. It could be the Alabama could be way too much for them to handle. So I think this is going to be an Alabama win. How big that gap is to be determined because it's SEC play. You never know what's going to happen.
Michaela, give me your prediction too then.
I am not going to even attempt to make a prediction about what will actually happen at the game on the field. But what I can tell you is that Tuscaloosa is going to be overwhelmed by Aggies this weekend, especially given that our fall break just miraculously falls on this weekend. So we don't have class on this upcoming Monday or Tuesday. So at the very least, I think we can expect maybe a little bit of maroon intermixing into the otherwise crimson tide. And I think it's going to be an exciting game regardless. I'm not expecting a complete blowout, but yeah, just interested to see. But from a stats perspective, Jordan, what do you think is going to happen?
So I will say that on this show, you guys weren't here for the last episode. As I mentioned, Mississippi State never went up, but I picked A&M to beat Mississippi State foolishly, and I am now 1-5 on predicting A&M on this podcast because that is the type of season A&M has had so far. I am taking Alabama to win this game, which only means that apparently A&M is going to win somehow because of the luck that I have had predicting on this show, because the only game I've gotten right was Sam Houston State. So I'm excited to see how this game goes. I want to say thank you to both of my guests for being on. I will turn to Ashley real quick. Where can people find you before we leave?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, even though I don't use TikTok, at Ashley, ASHLEEM Woods, WOODS, all lowercase. You can find me there. I'm mostly active on Twitter, but that's where you can find me. You can find the Crimson Light at the Crimson, CRIMSON and you can find the CW Sports. That's at CW Sports, capitalized or not capitalized. You're gonna find the same page, but that's where you can find us.
And then Michaela, where can people find you?
Yeah, on Twitter, main place you can find me, it's Michaela 4 Bats. So it's MICHAELA, the number 4, and then BATT. That's bat with 2 T's. Definitely can't always talk sports, but always happy to hear input. So
I'm very excited to have been welcomed by both of these guests for being on the show. And I want to say, make sure you guys check out the other podcasts on the Battalions Network. That includes the Bat Signal, our news podcast, and we have a Life and Arts one too that I think is still in the works. But I want to say thank you both for being on here. Thank you to everyone that watched, and I will see you all next time.